Hey Yimbies, I'm Laura Foote. I'm the Executive Director of Yimby Action. And on this episode, I'm joined by two housing advocates out of Virginia, Will Wilson and Brian Goggin. Virginia's legislative session ended in March, and now we're celebrating some pretty big wins. We're going to discuss the policies that were signed into law and how our local pro-housing coalition helped make this year one of the most high impact, certainly in the past few years, and really I think is setting up Virginia for being the next state that's just sort of passing pro-housing bills. I'm going to knock on wood as I say it, but I think it's a couple years now where the energy just keeps building and building. Will Wilson, why don't you go first and introduce yourself and talk about kind of your chapter and how you got into
Thank you, Laura.
housing a little bit.
Yeah, Will Wilson. I'm a chapter lead in Richmond, Virginia, RVA YIMBY. RVA, short for kind of the Richmond moniker for the Richmond, Virginia metro area. We're mostly based in the city of Richmond. We do have some members kind of in the surrounding counties. I've been a lead for 3 years. We got started around a parking reform requirement in 2023.
You were opposed, right? This is the
Yeah, kind of going along with the city and supporting a lot of the forward-thinking planning initiatives they had around. They were doing some things around Airbnbs, but they decided to also lump in some reforms with parking and accessory dwelling units. So it kind of motivated us for some changes. Just so happens our city hall is located directly across from the state legislative offices, Richmond being the capital of Virginia. So, it's been for a couple of years that leaving City Hall, looking across the street and understanding that we're probably going to end up there someday. And it's just kind of the natural next forum for some of our activities.
Brian, introduce yourself. You want to talk a little bit about your work?
Brian Goggin. I work for True Ground Housing Partners. We're a nonprofit affordable housing developer based in Northern Virginia, but we work throughout the DC region. We were a member of the Commonwealth Housing Coalition, which is the Virginia statewide YIMBY coalition. In my personal life, big believer in supply side reforms to address the housing shortage, fairly active in DC area YIMBY chapters like YIMBYs of Nova and DC YIMBYs as well. Excited to talk about what happened.
Well, so I guess big picture, let's start at the end. What did happen? What bills are you most excited about? What do you feel like is like the real victory here?
I think the big headline is for the first time ever, zoning reform bills with actual teeth passed in Virginia. We haven't even gotten out of committee in previous years. So the four major bills that passed that moved the needle in concrete ways are Faith in Housing, which HB 1279, for those looking things up. It creates a by right pathway for faith-owned land owned by churches and other eligible nonprofits. A lot of these faith orgs are in single-family only neighborhoods. We can go in depth into bills if you want, but
That's a good one. That's like a classic form these days of a yes in God's backyard.
I know other states are doing it too. Yeah, we passed a bill that mandates localities zoned for accessory dwelling units. It got watered down a bit at the end, but I think it's really great that it passed. That's a bill that had failed and tried several times before. And then we got local parking mandate reform bill, capping parking ratios near high capacity transit. And then finally, we legalized manufactured housing anywhere site-built housing is allowed.
One was interesting, the manufactured housing. It wasn't on our radar, I think, going into the session. It was brought to us by actually a new partner coming into the coalition, Randy Grumbine with I don't want to misstate his organization, but an advocate for manufactured housing, developers, communities, etc., coming to us with this idea. Virginia, we like to joke, I think, a little bit about, we haven't traditionally pushed the envelope on supply side reforms, on housing reforms. But I think manufactured housing is one where, looking back, we're actually one of the few states that have passed a statewide reform. I think Florida was playing with it this year, but it is kind of exciting for Virginia to sort of be ahead of right. We've talked about ADUs before in other states and some of the other things we've passed in previous sessions, but the manufactured housing one was my big kind of surprise victory for the year.
Interesting how triggering manufactured housing can be for people who are like, the aesthetic concerns. Like as soon as you start talking about prefab, modular, I can hear my mother's eye twitching right now as she's like having an aesthetic concern. The only thing she has in her mind is like, trailer parks and then I'm sort of like, okay, well, people are living in trailer parks because they need houses too. She can get there. I don't want to like shit on my mom too much, but I think this is like the manufactured housing like triggers some aesthetic concern that the NIMBYs frequently have, but it gives them something like how much opposition did that bill see, or was it among the other ones sort of not the spark that lit the fury under the oppositions?
No, that sailed. I think that did have a nice agreement there, right, Brian? Brian's kind of keeper of the books.
I don't think we had any no votes on that either in the House or the Senate, which is, I think, also a credit to the bipartisan nature of that bill. We had Americans for Prosperity really sponsoring it and pushing hard for it as well. I think, I stand corrected. I think there was one no vote on the Senate side. But I mean,
That's, I mean, maybe that sort of paints a path also in these purple states where you do need sort of the free market part of the coalition in order to make these arguments for some of these bills. I mean, you're going to need a lot of Republican votes. And if you can get in there and make arguments that are going to be compelling on both sides of the aisle. I mean, certainly we've seen that with the Yes and God backyard, that the idea of religious freedom and religious institutions being able to do what they think they need to do in order to serve the people. Certainly that's like a really compelling rhetorical lens to get these bills passed.
Absolutely.
I think manufactured housing also benefited from the fact that it's not changing density. And that's where a lot of the local opposition comes from with the other bills.
One thing I found interesting about that was the last one to be signed. I think the signing ceremony was actually just last week for that, but the governor, Abigail Spanberger, chose to actually go to speaking of supply side, actually a fabrication facility down in Southwest Virginia, Promised Land Homes, to actually sign that bill. And I was looking through their site and viewing all the different products they offer. But the interesting quote from someone affiliated with the company about how they actually send most of their housing stock out of state. It was an interesting sort of an area of Virginia that's recovering from some industrial recovery is needed to actually have a manufacturer of housing with employing a couple hundred people to come out and be an advocate for the bill. So I think that side as well was an interesting angle, I thought.
And there's play in here with the federal level as well, because we're looking at perhaps the 21st century road to housing bill is going to pass, and that's got expands modular housing and prefab a bit so that, under the auspices of interstate commerce to make it easier for companies that are doing that kind of modular and prefab to be able to export across state lines with more universal rules. So I think that it's definitely an industry that we could see really expanding if the federal government takes those action and if states sort of continue to make progress on it. It could be a real solution to the problems of the cost per unit just being so high on housing these days. I want to pivot also to the ADU bill. This is a podcast of nerds, so I'm going to go full nerd on this. One of the things that I found interesting about the ADU bill that came out was that it is mandating that cities pass local ADU accessory for the medium nerds people. ADU is an accessory dwelling unit, a backyard cottage or a granny flat, that they are telling cities that they're going to have to pass their own ADU bills. Are you guys worried about the implementation half of that and sort of how much malicious compliance we're going to see from city? And, that is the next phase. And I'm sort of, this didn't go the way that some states have gone where they're saying this is the ADUs. They are now legalized across the state. This went the sort of local control path where cities are going to be empowered to write their own rules, which does open up a whole new bucket of worms. But I'm curious, how are you guys thinking about this?
Definitely a new line of thinking because, like Brian alluded to, we haven't had a substantial suite of bills be passed in previous sessions. A study bill around single stair a couple years ago, a subdivision ordinance, but now tracking 3 or 4 bills I've gotten through and tracking local implementation of them is kind of a new, it's a new good problem to have. So I'm curious what your take is, Brian, because it's something I know the ADU bill did put some guardrails, some good guardrails around some of the worst poison pills associated with ADU legislation, but there are some concerns. I think the main one being a grandfathering of some past ADU for some of our biggest jurisdictions if they had something on the books. But I'll let you go into that.
I don't know a whole lot more than you, but it was hard to pass that bill. It did get watered down over the course of session. In an ideal world, we would have passed a mandatory statewide standards. I think we're several cycles less mature than some other states, like California, have been at this for a long time. Like Will said, I think it's really important that we got over this hump, that zoning reform can pass. And now, as we look to the next cycles, implementation is one of our focuses.
One of the things I think that you're sort of alluding to, but I do think is like a common theme, is that we see states first pass bills that are empowering local governments to do things. That's what's politically viable, is this path of, we're going to put a little bit of pressure from the state, but it's still going to be a local control focus. And then they sort of have to see that that's not moving the needle enough before they're willing to come in and do the state preemption. And so I think, this speaks to a sort of important path for YIMBYs in Virginia, is that tracking the success or failure of the local control path around ADUs, I think is going to be really important for being able to come back and take that second and third and fourth bite at the apple.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there are, fortunately and unfortunately, there are, in Northern Virginia especially, there are a lot of localities with accessory dwelling unit ordinances already on the books. Unfortunately, they aren't very effective. They have requirements like unique setback requirements that really narrow down where they're feasible to build. And unfortunately as well, the state law, one of the compromises we made to pass the law is, like Will said, grandfathered in those existing ordinances where they're on the books. But Richmond has a good one, right, Will?
Well, Richmond City has a great one, and unfortunately, some of our surrounding suburban jurisdictions, they did not allow accessory dwelling uses previously. They will now have to adopt ordinances under this new framework. So that is exciting a little bit. There's a little momentum around that. We've had an ADU ordinance in the city, a pretty liberal one for a few years now. It was a great article that came out yesterday, just tracking the ADU permits. Journalists provided a map and interviewed some of the key developers associated with kind of getting this going. It's really about 3 to 5 developers in our city really taking advantage of this new legislation and adding this new stock. And what I'm excited about is now, we have Richmond City, which is population-wise, a small fragment of the region, an ecosystem of developers who are going to have cut their teeth for 3 to 5 years before these surrounding jurisdictions will now have to allow accessory uses in all their residential districts. So I'm excited for the opportunity it provides our small ecosystem of developers, provides for the rest of the region. So yeah, unfortunate in some areas that did have mature ADU policy, that those will be grandfathered in, but for vast majority of jurisdictions in the state, county, cities, it will be pushing the needle for the first time. We had the largest jurisdiction in our region, Chesterfield County, just south of Richmond, actually forego, it's a good example of where this will be impactful, is they just went through a comprehensive zoning rewrite last year. ADUs were going to be a part of it. It drew too much attention. They decided to punt that till, we'll circle back to it down the road. Well, now they have to circle back to it within the next year and a half. So that's encouraging to at least be keeping it on the table, keeping them talking about.
ADUs are an interesting one because you both get people who, you get the contractors who are sort of have been doing kitchen remodels, start getting into the ADU business once that's sort of a path. And you get in California, when we first legalized ADUs, there were 100 little startups around the ADU. And it was a little bit easier for them to be, this is sort of the how do these things work? Because the rules were set at the state level, you saw firms open that sort of had this big ambition to be able to drop them across the state. And kind of because ADUs end up being so site specific, a lot of them were not as successful as they could have. Some were okay successful, but actually the contractors had a pretty good game of it, because they, you actually do have to come in and figure out a lot of local stuff and working with that local homeowner anyway. And so you saw a lot of little firms get ADU specialization, and sort of that industry was able to flourish. And that industry did a lot of the work of educating homeowners that this was something they could do. Because I think that's another piece of why do we not always see the market respond to these new laws, there's an education component there as well. I like how much press the Yes in God's Backyard bills get, because like communicating with a million little faith institutions to get them to realize that they could build housing is like really hard. Like I'm hoping that like the faith community also is engaged on this bill, that they're paying attention and able to take advantage of it in a sort of bigger way than they otherwise would.
Yeah, especially with that one, because I think one of the pare downs through some of the legislative negotiations there was a sunset clause, unfortunately. So there's a timer. I mean, of course, we hope to come back in a couple of years and maybe axe that. Brian, do you want to speak a little bit? Because that drew a lot of attention in Northern Virginia.
Yeah, for faith and housing specifically.
For some of the opposition was kind of situated there in Arlington, and
Yeah, timer is such a ridiculous thing. I mean, sorry, not to jump in, but like of all the things.
I think the faith and housing bill, well, I know it's called YIGBY in other states. I think we called it YIGBY at first, but then we switched the name because of reasons. It was the vanguard of our YIMBY movement this year. And that's really credit to some of our key member organizations. Voice Virginia was really one of our most active member orgs. They're a coalition of faith leaders throughout the state, all religious beliefs. And there are, I guess, just to give a big picture, there are a lot of faith orgs in Virginia, about 74,000 acres of land. A lot of them are old and aging. This is similar to other states, but have deferred maintenance they can't keep up with. And they're active. They don't just go to church every Sunday. They're active in their faith and in social movements in their communities. One of the things I wanted to do is to build housing to serve their community. When they started looking into it and they start hearing back from land use lawyers and architects and developers, oh, you can't do that. You can only build a McMansion or 2 McMansions on a 5,000 square foot lot. Naturally, like I think how unjust the land use system is, really a light bulb turned on in that community. And to their credit, they didn't just advocate for the faith and housing bill, they advocated for all our bills as well. Obviously, the faith and housing being, their big one.
I think this is really common, right? Somebody comes in having hit up against how zoning and permitting is thwarting what they want to do that's, good for society. And it's a radicalizing experience. To sort of go back to the beginning, right? So Joe on our team has been helping manage the Commonwealth Housing Coalition, which has been the driving force for a lot of these bills, and the sort of coalition where the clearinghouse, everybody's coming forward and bringing bills and getting everybody to sign on. And that's been really successful for you guys. I mean, I think that's been something that, getting people who can maybe enter really focused on one bill, but then being exposed to the need for housing at all income levels and getting support for their bills, moving the organizations quite quickly to a mutual support place has been really effective.
Absolutely. I mean, these faith orgs too have been such a energetic, important part of the coalition. Just the energy, just the emails, the advocacy side of things, all the meetings we've had leading up to session and in session. They were huge participation in the lobby day we had. So
It's great to have like a priest and a rabbi on your lobby day, right? It really does help add that like moral authority.
yeah.
yeah. And some of the op-eds they wrote, I mean, there was a couple op-eds that came from people affiliated with different religious denominations. It was just, I think it's amazing when the coalition gets this big. I think I'm not sure, but, significant increase in number of organizations from what we were the year before.
Like 30 to 60, just about, yeah.
It starts running itself to the point, all these organizations that were comprised, a lot of them are not new to legislative advocacy. They're having conversations anyway. They're now injecting you have a representative that might hear the same set of ideas from somebody affiliated with Habitat for Humanity. Their next meeting with the Chamber of Commerce, they're hearing about the same set of priorities. It's it's amazing. I think from Joe's side, maybe it's harder to organize and keep track of all the different contacts, but at some point it gets to a point where it feels like there's some
Momentum.
momentum. That's the word.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is one thing we've seen also. And Brian, you kind of embody this, right? Like the YIMBY movement and our ideas, we have individual members who I mean, the impolite word is sleeper cell, but the I don't know what the polite word, right? But it's like members who then are in other organizations who are passionate, who are then moving their organization to get more active and understand, they're doing the internal lobbying. I know in the Habitat for Humanity, in all of these organizations, you end up with like the YIMBY spokesperson who's in that organization and helping move that organization as well. I think that's one of the real sort of underappreciated, and we've got this grassroots organizing where you've got some people like you, Will, who I don't know, what's your day job? It's something totally unrelated.
Yeah, GIS analyst.
Okay, so a little related, yeah. And then we've got people like Brian who are in an affordable housing industry and kind of trying to bring that entire industry along with you. And both are really critical. You need the sort of like, I'm just a normal constituent here, passionate for housing. And then you also need the people who are like embedded in an entire other world of power and bringing those people into, and when they then, let's go full Yigby on this, when the choir is all singing the same song, right?
Right. Right.
You get, this chorus that I think can be really, I mean, you guys had some real opposition, but then, we're able to overcome that in a lot of places with this kind of broad, large, grassroots based, but, a lot of different organizations coming out and speaking. I don't know if you want to like, talk about the opposition a little bit. They didn't have a great year. I mean, they did get the timer put on the Yigby bill. They did get some.
But this wasn't directly from a negotiated legislation, but the governor did come into in Virginia, we have don't know how unique the situation is. The governor can propose adjustments to text that has passed both chambers and send it back. And the governor did come down. There's a great article coverage of that by Emily Hamilton in Greater Washington. If maybe we could link it.
We'll link it, yeah.
But a couple things that they did, we had a pretty strong, the context of that development that could take place on a nonprofit site or a religious site for that affordable housing could, in reference to the built context of the surrounding area, governor came in and actually put some amendments on it that adjusted it. So any special use case that was facilitated, it could not reference that special use case or that rezoning. It had to be a by right height allowance in reference to. So there's a couple cases like that where we did have some surprise amendments from the governor's office, I think. There might be a couple others.
Yeah, I think the opposition in Virginia is similar to other states. We have the Association of County Governments, Municipal League, they're against it.
Yeah.
If you're in control locally, you in fact want local control. Yeah.
We have some big counties, one particularly big jurisdiction, Fairfax County, and counties have their own lobbyists who are generally opposed to our bills. They're better funded than state reps. They have more staff than state reps, so they have more capacity to do homework. State representatives in Virginia, they make $18,000 a year. I mean, this is something I learned. They're part-time. They have at most one staff person. So really, you have to do all the homework for them. They're not just working on housing, they're working on bills for everything.
And on a much shorter timeline than in some other states. I mean, California, we're sort of like, I don't know if it ends up being good, right? So I'm sort of like, we have like a full-time legislature. They have a lot of staff, which means they write some pretty complicated bills, and they manage to put a lot of little things into each other's bills that reduce the efficacy of them. So I don't,
Maybe there's a happy medium. But Virginia, I think part of the power imbalance in land use is due to the fact that our state reps are not empowered in the way they're paid or the way they're staffed to have more oversight. But
it means a lot goes on to either, the nefarious version is the lobbyist, and then the less nefarious version is us activists, right? Doing the homework for them.
I think particularly the fact that a lot of faith orgs are located in very wealthy areas tend to be located in single family only, wealthier, more politically powerful neighborhoods in Arlington and Fairfax, in Loudoun County, in Alexandria.
Help in need people.
Yeah.
And poor people. I mean, what kind of morals are those?
Yeah, right. It's ironic because it's the places where housing could have the most impact. And these are very powerful neighborhood associations in these areas as well that are connected, and we're able to get like some local officials to fight really hard against these bills as well at the state level.
Yeah, it's amazing how much a few key civic associations can really drive a narrative. Because I mean, a lot of those, the loudest ones seem to be reserved for parts of that Northern Virginia area. We barely heard that down in our region, even though we are going through some zoning changes in the city that actually do have an impact on what churches can do. And there's an independent discussion. There was an independent discussion of what the state's doing, but you know, this never received a lot of pushback. The civic associations didn't seem clued into, but it was just a couple key ones in Northern Virginia that really seemed to be taking some of that opposition. Maybe in the Hampton Roads region as well. But it's funny how just a few civic associations with some time can really drive state level narrative on opposition.
Yeah, keep it quiet in Richmond. We don't want them coming up.
You know, we have this YIMBY reform passed. We're still going through our citywide rezoning. The planning department had come out and they were trying to give congregations more leeway about what they can do with their property. Like you said, a lot of these churches, they assumed a lot of the residential zoning that was part of the neighborhood. It was never really a fit for the operation of a religious church or some of the supporting services. Now the planning department's saying, well, this draft 3, we can defend a mixed use zoning a little bit because the state's already kind of come in and said these churches have an avenue to at least do one or two things with their property that we don't have control of. So why don't we kind of set the groundwork and maybe we can give them a couple more options. We can give the neighborhood a couple more options. So it is funny to see it on both sides of this YIMBY bill passing, kind of how the narrations change.
Yeah, and maybe just to round up how the final form of the bill took shape. Basically, Governor Spanberger's team, governors in Virginia don't have a lot of time in their especially in their first year, to be very active in the session, given the election is only a few months before the session happens. So they were hearing from both sides, and this is a little bit described in the Gigi Wash piece that Will referenced. And I think they made what they considered to be a compromise. Unfortunately, it watered down our bills, added a sunset clause to the faith and housing. It also muddled up a little bit of the language around height. But I think it's a huge success for our side to have a by right path with a minimum height and a minimum density. Those were preserved.
I mean, it's a big step to be like, these first round of state preemption bills being faith and housing bills is a good avenue because they bring that moral authority to help you have that fight about it. And I think that once you see communities doing it, and you establish the norm. The other thing I think about these sort of thinking about these state legislative sessions as iterative. You guys went and had hundreds of conversations with legislators who are now thinking about the housing shortage differently. You had mobilization days. They got to see firsthand the activists. They're seeing that there are local chapters in their communities popping up. They're seeing the broad-based coalition. This is an iterative game, right? That education of the state legislature, like last year was setting the groundwork for that. This year, you had some real victories. Next year, I think is very optimistic for being able to see you've established. I think half of the battle is establishing that there's a problem that the state legislature has a moral obligation to solve. And once you're in that mode, then everybody's like, oh, well, I guess I have to be proposing a bill. You might see that, you get twice as many bills proposed next year, even from the haters, are sort of like they have to kind of buy into the idea that there is a capital P problem and that they're supposed to be doing something, even if what they're proposing is kind of pathetic nonsense.
Yeah, it's refreshing to hear your bird's eye view. Hopefully we're like following that trajectory.
I definitely see it. I mean, I think, and let's give some shout out. You guys have some real champions who are emerging on this in your state legislature as well, who are going to be like, okay, round 3, here we come.
Skylar Van Valkenburg, he's a state senator from the Richmond region. Some of them have kind of coined him as Virginia's Scott Wiener. But, he had a couple great standing orations. One this year, he's a school teacher, public school teacher, talking about how new teachers coming in his region cannot afford the same housing opportunities that he had when he was starting out as a teacher. And that's kind of his perspective. And he's kind of owned that and really driven that narrative and become one of our kind of biggest champions.
I think that's really powerful when you establish that the housing haters, right, and the sort of NIMBYs and the local government control, they want to keep the issue to be one of like aesthetics and what's the height, and they want want to keep it in the technical. And I think this is like it, the more you can move it into the stories of the people who need the housing, the more powerful it becomes.
Yeah.
I guess we didn't mention that. Just I'm thinking of him now. We did have some bills that didn't make it. There was a couple things that he had proposed that did not get to the governor's desk, unfortunately, around by right housing in commercially zoned areas, and then a housing targets idea, which would allow if counties couldn't make up a certain percentage of housing unit growth over a time frame, they could adopt other grab bag of policies. Those two initiatives didn't make it. They were carryovers, reintroduced from last year. He was the Senate sponsor on manufactured housing legislation, so we did get that one through. But a great collection of delegates and senators now in Virginia.
Absolutely. Senator Srinivasan also deserves credit for the accessory dwelling units bill, bringing it back multiple years in a row. I mean, I think it's 3 or 4 years he's brought it back. It's failed in committee, and he's brought it back every time to see it finally get over the hump. It was really cool politically. I mean, to see him rewarded for that.
Can I add more to make you guys happier?
Yeah.
ADUs are one of the more unique policies in that as soon as you have some established, like, oh, these are supposed to be more doable statewide, all of the NIMBYs kind of steadily flip from no to yes on ADUs because their grandkids can't afford to live in the state. Their kids are boomerang kids living in their basement. And so the like flip of actually, maybe I want to build an ADU and this is like a homeowner's rights thing. It's like immediate how much the making it a bit more legal to build ADUs suddenly can flip everybody to being like, oh, this is like a property right that I want. Hasn't quite happened with duplexes, triplexes, that when you start getting into the missing middle, for some reason, like, I mean, I think part of it is sort of the economics of taking on a project of building a duplex is just more complicated, more whatever, but they can see themselves building an ADU. And so you end up with year after year of ADU cleanup legislation that just strengthens the ADU pipelines. I don't want to, I'm going to knock on wood, but I think legalizing ADUs is now on autopilot. You'll see even like NIMBY people proposing legislation to make ADUs easier over the next few years. That is my prediction.
Hopefully. It's like a fifth of California's housing production now.
Well, that's more about how sad sack the rest of our housing production is.
But there's a real industry, right? Hopefully that can come here.
I'm going to call it. I think it's going to take off. And, we can be very optimistic about that.
Before we move on real quick, I just want to also thank Senator McPike, Delegate Dan Helmer for the Faith and Housing Bill as well. And Delegate Cole as well for the Faith and Housing Bill. We're on a podcast on the airwaves here. I give official thanks.
Oh, definitely. It's our job to build the parade so that when they say these good things, there's a bunch of people clapping for them. But, the first step of stepping out into that, how big is this new coalition? Is this actually going to be a winning issue for me? It's high risk. And so like giving those, elected officials who are sort of the first vanguard a lot of credit is really important. So you shout their names, right?
Yeah, and Shelley Simmons down in Newport News, I believe, was the original. That parking bill kind of got recombined, and
Irene Shin was the eventual as the bill got transformed.
And we didn't talk too much about that one. That was the one that probably changed the most, if I had to argue a little bit, because it was a cleaner bill. It was just targeting parking requirements in commercial zones, but then it got pared down to transit lines and then sub-definitions of transit lines.
Laura gave bad advice at the beginning of the session. Okay, so when Joe was like, "Oh, we're gonna be working on this parking one," I was like, "Don't touch parking. The parking people are fucking crazy. You got this nice ADU thing. You got this nice yes in God's backyard. People are like going to," and then it was like, well, maybe it'll like get all of the arrows will be pointed at parking reform, and so you can get these kinds of like, what's the 3D chess. But I am so surprised that you guys got a little parking reform out there.
We have a project actually that is going to benefit from this bill. It's going through entitlements right now. It's near Metro, and the parking requirement is higher than we would have wanted. We would have had to file for a special study and a special process, months of meetings, and a county board vote on it, on the parking. And now it's just an administrative check the box. So that saves us tens of thousands of dollars.
Yeah, are you able to do a calculation on like what, especially for affordable, everybody scrutinizes the cost per unit so much. I mean, that's a lot of money to be saving.
Parking study, give or take $8,000. The time of land use council is a couple $1,000s. for the time they would have had to take preparing for meetings and things like that.
I mean, how much layer cake of funding do you guys have that are on all these different timelines?
Yeah, and timing, right. And the silly thing is like staff, they're not always supportive of parking reductions, but in this case they were. So instead of having to go through the song and dance, paying consultants and filing things and putting on a public meeting and things like that, we can avoid all those costs in time.
I can never, like, the local government alliances, right? They don't see how much time and money that they are wasting of their own city budgets on all this nonsense. And it's like, I would love to see, like, how much did the city spend to have 5 hearings,
Staff time too, right?
staff time prepping, like,
I think with that, it will be interesting. The one bill we haven't talked about is didn't receive a lot of government pushback because it is an enabling bill. It is one that would allow localities to actually cut out public hearings for rezonings that have some affordable housing component. So it'll be interesting to see that the counties that have a willingness to adopt that, enable that, and the ones who don't adopt it. So Richmond City, hope to be a first mover on it. There's certainly a range within local governments. Some, I think, do want to see some changes.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is interesting with the enabling bills. You see some, I mean, this is sort of, as we've sort of seen this in various states across the country now, these kinds of enabling bills, you'll have cities that still have a pro-growth mentality that will grab onto and want to take advantage of it. And I think that's good. And it makes me like very nervous about like how much do we let the wealthiest enclaves just like completely off the hook. And I think that there's definitely like a strategy debate in the sort of pro-housing movement about how much weight do we put on integration and, making wealthy communities do their part. And like, it's interesting, like a Yes in God's Backyard is really pushing that integration narrative, letting low-income people into high-income neighborhoods. That's like sort of the point of friction. And then there's the other sort of cast of bills that are like upzoning along transit corridors and are often focused on maybe it goes as far as redeveloping a mall, right? That's kind of like commercial, but it's kind of pick the shittiest neighborhood, pick the worst looking street in your area, and we're going to allow housing there. And like you get a lot of units out of that strategy, right? Because you can then sort of do them at like 40-story high because everyone's like, well, I didn't really want to preserve the target anyway, so whatever.
It's a little bit complicated in Virginia as well, in that there's a unique thing in Virginia where the history of Virginia land use law, mostly our localities are restricted from leveraging impact fees on development. So this has created a huge incentive system where a lot of localities rely on proffers to fund infrastructure improvements for housing, but they can only do so if...
Well, what's a proffer?
A proffer is a condition on a development paying for infrastructure or like a related community benefit for a housing project.
This is like the classic a rose by any other name, right? It's not an impact fee. It's a specific bribe you offered in order to get your project through.
Yeah, legalized bribe is the uncharitable way of describing a proffer. And proffers in Virginia can only be leveraged if there's a rezoning involved. So this is creating an incentive system where a lot of localities have a very low base zoning, only allow housing projects through rezoning, only approve housing through discretionary rezoning processes so that they can have proffers to pay for infrastructure. There's huge disincentives for allowing housing by right. And I think enabling bills, I'm skeptical of enabling bills in the Virginia context for that reason. Localities just don't have an incentive to do it unless there's some sort of a stick.
Looking forward to the next year. I mean, that's a good like thing to be keeping a real eye on. What do you think, people should be really focused on for next year? What's next for the coalition? What are you really excited about? I don't know if you want to share. I know people are gossiping about what bills are going to be introduced next year, but what are you guys really excited about? How much do you want to share?
Well, you want to go first?
Dear Brian, we got to come up with some new...
There's no new ideas in land use, first of all, right? It's going to be recycled from other places.
I mean, to be totally transparent, the coalition has not determined our legislative agenda, but we have started tossing around ideas. I think certainly housing near jobs is going to come back. We want to support Senator Van Valkenburg in that effort. I think it just makes sense. We're not done trying zoning reform, and that's one of the biggest most impactful reforms we could have, I think, allowing more housing in commercial zones. I think we're going to have cleanup legislation around some of the bills we passed this year. And then, interested on your take, Laura. I mean, the rest of the YIMBY movement seems to be, I think, rightfully moving towards permitting and site plan reform as well, which I think could be really impactful here. So things around stormwater, sidewalks, infrastructure, making sure those requirements are well calibrated to the actual impacts of new development rather than open-ended.
Yeah, make sure Joe's okay with me, but I have heard. First off, we have a successful bill from a couple of years ago that was a study bill that looked at Virginia don't tend to legislate building code directly, but to kind of pass off some direction to commissions to come to certain conclusions around edits to the building code. So we had success with a single story study bill a couple of years ago that just, as of a couple of weeks ago, have a recommendation to take our single stair from 3 to 4 stories in Virginia under certain commercial code definitions. Could we kind of repeat that pattern? And maybe one that I'd like to see is to take our cutoff from a 3-unit site plan now, 3-unit development now takes you from residential to commercial code, layers on some complications. North Carolina and some other states are playing around with forget some of those cutoffs, but it's certainly higher than the 2-unit that we have now, residential building code. That's something I've heard talk of informally. Another one, check with Joe to make sure I'm not leaking anything, but around single room occupancy and putting some guardrails or incentives around local governments providing for single room occupancy provisions in their zoning codes. But like you said, haven't had formal conversations yet. So
yeah, I agree with all that. And like one of the challenges I'm grappling with is we need to pass more laws than we have capacity for, like to advocate for.
If this session's any lesson though, and like you said, Laura, people kind of wanted to raise their hands and introduce things because the problem has been underlined by us for a few years now. I mean, there's a number of bills that came out this session that I don't know if we planted the seed formally or not. The parking reform kind of had its own origination story. We hopped on it. I think cutting out the public hearings for affordable housing rezonings, I think that had its own independent origination story. We sort of adopted it into our program. But then there are people throwing things out there that we kind of have to. Our package this year was bigger than we anticipated, or different than we anticipated. So now it's trying to get ahead of what certain delegates, senators want to do, and hopefully funnel some energy that's maybe independent of our kind of planting of ideas. So
the YIMBYs are such a funny group of people, right? Because it's people who have, like, generally, right, a lot of love of detail and nerdiness and true like policy passion. But we're trying to like get everybody to realize actually what moves the needle is activists, is telling personal stories, not getting up there and being like, this chart demonstrates that single stair reform will cause a 14.3% increase in housing production. It's like you need that like teacher telling their story, harmonizing those two so that, and I think the Virginia Coalition is doing a really great job. I want to give you guys credit for it, but you're at this stage now where there's going to be more bills than you can control and that you can really like keep your fingers on necessarily, and riding that wave and getting that skill of, okay, we're going to support a lot of things and, let 1,000 flowers bloom, make sure that some of those flowers aren't like what starts to happen at this next stage is that you get the person who's introducing a bill that looks like it's a pro ADU bill, but has poison pills that are going to pull back things, right? That starts to happen. And so you have to like get this like nimbleness where it's very easy to spend all your time really dialed in and reading the bills, and you have to do some of that, but can you outsource some of that? Can you get your coalition partners and be in a strong enough coalition that different people are bringing their assets? Can you get Habitat for Humanity to do bill analysis on like 3 to 5 bills or whatnot? And remember that this is the kind of like hardest part, is that the complexity is also like a signal that we haven't really won, right? Because you get a lot of little, a little pissant bills, right? This is my prediction also. I think next year in Virginia, you're going to get 100 pissant bills. Because it's like, oh, well, housing's hot, right? And so you'll get a lot of people who are introducing bills that move the needle 1% forward. And you're like, okay, this is so what has happened in California. I think this past year, we had like 215 housing related bills. Okay, they're like moving the ball forward like a teensy, each one. Oh, here's my little bit of the ball I'm moving forward. but like you have to keep growing your outside game, because you don't get somebody introducing the most high, something that would cut through 90% of the bull crap until you've got more people, so it's sort of like, how do you maintain this balance of tracking all those bills and being, riding the wave in the legislature, while knowing that like we need like 10 more chapters in Virginia, right? Like the kinds of biggest reform are going to happen when the coalition is 2 or 3 times bigger. They feel it in their district. And so you've got that wave mentality. Virginia is one of those states that I'm really excited about because I think it is happening. And how do you kind of build that wave while not getting dragged into the minutia, right? You have to like pay enough attention to some of the little bills while not letting it overwhelm you and distract you from growing more chapters.
Yeah, if there are any Virginians out there,
Yeah.
we have 4 chapters. The YIMBYs of Northern Virginia, YIMBYs Hampton Roads, RVA YIMBY in Richmond region. So kind of that urban crescent, including Fredericksburg. We got a Fredericksburg chapter now, 15-minute Fredericksburg, but especially need chapters in the western, southwestern part of the state. I-81, Harrisonburg, Roanoke, Lynchburg would all be great candidates. Danville even. Get in touch with us.
Visit Commonwealth Housing Coalition.org and send us an email, sign up. We're open for business.
Yeah, especially orgs who want to join the coalition, I think that would be great. We'll put all these links. If you want to start a chapter, link will be in the podcast. And I think we can end it there. I just want to thank everybody for listening to this episode of Infill. If you are excited, of course, about starting a chapter or just want to become a member, yimbyaction.org/join, where we fight. Oh, this is good. I've got my lingo here. We fight for abundant, affordable, sustainable, and equitable communities for people across the U.S. Thanks, Ryan and Will.